The night the county road crew tore down Walter Baines's black iron gate, every porch light in Briar Glen came on at once. Walter stood in the rain in his yellow raincoat, both hands raised over his head like the whole world had betrayed him, shouting that I was destroying private property, while I sat in my old Chevy pickup with a thermos of coffee between my knees and watched a man finally lose control of a road he had never owned. I remember thinking, well, Walter, that is the trouble with building a kingdom on somebody else's land. Sooner or later, somebody shows up with the deed. My name is Ruth Mercer. I was 48 years old in the fall of 1995, and I had lived at the end of Old Mill Lane outside Hollow Creek, Pennsylvania, since I was 19. My daddy built that little white farmhouse himself in 1958, back when the land around us was all apple trees, cornfields, and one rusted gas station that sold bait, cigarettes, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. By 1995, the orchards were mostly gone, the fields had been carved into neat little lots, and a development called Briar Glen had spread around my place like a fancy new carpet. Someone had rolled out without asking whether the old furniture underneath was still there. I was not against new houses, not really. I had a daughter, Claire, who had moved to Pittsburgh after college, and said she wanted a place with sidewalks, coffee shops, and people who did not know her father had once driven a tractor through the high school football field. I understood wanting something newer, but I also understood that old things had a way of holding you together when life had taken enough from you already. My husband, David, had died 3 years earlier, quick and cruel, pancreatic cancer, gone before either of us had learned how to say goodbye without sounding scared. After he passed, I kept the house, kept the workshop, kept his old flannel shirts hanging in the mudroom because I could not bring myself to move them, and I started restoring furniture in my father's old shed behind the house. Kitchen tables, cedar chests, bentwood chairs, anything people were too sentimental or too cheap to throw away. It did not make me rich, but it kept the lights on, and it gave me something to do with my hands when the nights got long. Then Walter Baines decided my little piece of land was standing in the way of his future. Walter was the president of the Briar Glen Covenant Committee, which sounded like a respectable job until you met him. He was 58, broad across the middle, red-faced in the summer, always wearing loafers that looked too shiny for a man who spent so much time walking through other people's yards. He had owned a hardware store in town once, then sold it when the big chain store came in off Route 18. After that, he seemed to need a new place to be important, and Briar Glen gave him one. He had a clipboard, a set of keys, a secretary at the committee office, and a habit of saying things like, "We have standards here," as if he personally invented grass, fences, and decent behavior. The first time Walter came to my porch, he brought a bottle of wine in an envelope. I should have known right there the trouble was coming, because Walter Baines was not the type of man who brought wine unless there was a bill hidden somewhere nearby. He smiled at me like we were old friends, looked down at my porch swing and said, "Ruth, I have an opportunity for you." I remember folding my arms and saying, "That usually means I'm about to lose money." He laughed like I had made a joke for his benefit, then handed me the envelope. Inside was an offer from a company called Harrison Ridge Development. They wanted to buy a strip of my land 30 feet wide, running along the edge of the creek behind my workshop. They said it was for a future access road, nothing major, just a small extension to connect Briar Glen to a planned set of new homes behind the hill. The number on the paper was low, insultingly low, the kind of number you offer somebody when you think they are scared, tired, or desperate enough to mistake pressure for kindness. I asked Walter why Harrison Ridge had sent him instead of coming to me themselves. He leaned against my porch rail, looked out at the fields, and said, "Because the community needs this road, Ruth. It will improve property values, bring in new families, make Briar Glen safer. You would be helping everyone." I looked at that skinny strip of land on the map, then at the old pear tree my daddy planted beside the shed, then back at Walter. "Walter," I said, "that land is where my father taught my daughter how to ride a bicycle. It is where my husband buried our old dog. It is not a shortcut." His smile changed then, not all at once, but enough. "You should think about it," he said. "Things are changing around here." "They always are," I told him. "That does not mean I have to sell my yard. At first, the trouble came in small ways. A letter appeared in my mailbox saying my workshop might violate Briar Glen standards because customers sometimes came by to pick up furniture. Another letter said my truck was too old to be parked where it could be seen from the development entrance. Then someone complained that the paint on my back shed was faded, which it was, because it was a shed, not the lobby of the Marriott. I called the Covenant office and asked why Briar Glen was sending me notices when my property had never been included in the development. The secretary, a nice woman named Pam, who always sounded embarrassed when Walter was involved, told me Walter believed the committee had authority over any property that affected the appearance of the neighborhood. I said, Pam, my house was standing there before Briar Glen had a sign, a clubhouse, or a man in loafers telling people what color their porch railings should be. She laughed before she could stop herself, then went quiet and said, I will tell him you called. Walter started coming by in his dark green Lincoln Town car, slowing down at the end of my driveway, taking notes on a yellow legal pad like he was inspecting enemy territory. Some days he parked just far enough across the gravel lane that I had to swing wide through the grass to get out. When I confronted him, he always had an excuse. He was checking drainage. He was reviewing the road shoulder. He was waiting for someone. One morning I had a delivery scheduled, an antique dining set from a widow in town, and Walter had his Lincoln sitting sideways across Old Mill Lane with 2 orange cones behind it. I rolled down my window and yelled, Walter, move that car. He looked at his watch, took his time, then said, I am reviewing a safety concern. The safety concern is that your car is blocking the only road to my house. He shrugged. There are larger issues here, Ruth. I climbed out of my truck, walked right up to his driver's side window and said, No, there is one issue right here, and it is sitting in a green Lincoln pretending it owns the road. That was the first time I saw real anger cross his face. He rolled up the window, moved the car, and drove off without a word. 2 days later, I got a certified letter from a law office in Pittsburgh. It said Briar Glen had concerns about unregulated commercial activity on my property, and that the development was considering legal action if I did not stop using the workshop. I sat at my kitchen table reading that letter while a pot of coffee burned on the stove, and for the first time since David died, I felt that old heavy feeling in my chest, the one that tells you the world has decided you are alone again. I wanted to call Claire, but she had enough on her plate. A new job, a tiny apartment, a boyfriend I had not met yet because he was apparently allergic to small towns and family dinners. So I called the one person in Hollow Creek who knew how to read old property maps without squinting, a retired county surveyor named Earl Denton. Earl was 72, had a voice like gravel in a coffee can, and had spent most of his life walking fields with measuring chains and a metal transit tripod. He lived in a brick ranch house near the old bowling alley and kept every map he had ever touched rolled up in cardboard tubes in his basement. When I showed him the letter, he pushed his glasses up his nose and said, Walter Baines, huh? That boy has been trying to turn this county into a country club since Reagan was in office. I asked him if Briar Glen had any right to tell me what I could do on my land. Earl did not answer right away. He took me to the courthouse the next morning, and we spent 4 hours in the records room with microfiche machines, old deed books, and a clerk named Linda who had blue hair and smelled like peppermint gum. Earl found the original plat for my father's property, dated June 17, 1958. Then he found another document, one my daddy had filed when he sold the surrounding acreage to a farmer in 1966. It was a recorded right-of-way, 20 feet wide, running from Old Mill Lane across the very strip of land Walter now claimed belonged to Briar Glen. My daddy had made sure the house would always have legal access to the county road, no matter who bought the fields around it. Earl tapped the paper with one thick finger and said, There it is, Ruth. Your father was smarter than Walter Baines, and your father has been dead 11 years. I laughed so hard I nearly cried. I made copies of everything, took them home, put them in a manila folder, and drove straight to the Briar Glen office. Walter was in a meeting, but I told Pam I would wait. 40 minutes later, he came out with 2 committee members behind him, both of them men who wore golf shirts in October and nodded whenever Walter spoke. He looked irritated when he saw me, then worse when I put the deed on his conference table. This right-of-way is recorded, I said. It is older than Briar Glen, older than the covenants, older than your little committee. You do not control Old Mill Lane, and you do not control my workshop. Walter looked at the paper, then at me. That road is no longer suitable for use. That is not what the deed says. The community has changed. The deed did not. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his stomach. You are making this difficult, Ruth. I remember how calm his voice was, which somehow made it uglier. I am not making anything difficult, I said. You came to my porch and asked me to give away part of my land for less than it was worth. I said no. Everything after that was your decision. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Walter smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. "We will see," he said. I stood up, picked up my folder, and looked him dead in the eye. "Yes," I said, "I think we will." Part 2. The Midle. The next few weeks were the kind that make you start checking the window every time a car slows down outside. Walter did not come after me with one big dramatic move. He came after me the way people like him always do, with paper, gossip, and little bites meant to make you tired enough to quit. He told neighbors I was running an illegal business. He told the county zoning office I was storing hazardous materials in my workshop. He even told a few people I had plans to sell my place to a salvage company that would turn Old Mill Lane into a truck route. That one was almost funny because my biggest business decision that month was whether I could afford a new sander. Still, rumors have a way of getting under your skin. One afternoon, I was sanding an old walnut sideboard when a woman from Briar Glen pulled into my driveway. Her name was Marlene Hodge, and I knew her only because she once bought a refinished rocking chair for me for her grandson. She stepped out of her minivan looking nervous, holding a casserole dish under one arm. I thought maybe she was bringing food because somebody had died, which was usually why people brought casseroles in Hollow Creek. Instead, she said, "Ruth, I do not know if this is any of my business, but Walter told everyone you are trying to stop the emergency access road." I wiped sawdust off my hands and said, "There is no emergency access road. There is a developer who wants a cheap shortcut through my property." Marlene looked embarrassed. "That is not what he said." "I know." She stood there for a second, then handed me the casserole. "It is chicken and rice. My husband likes it better the next day." That was how people started choosing sides in Hollow Creek, not with speeches or petitions, but with casseroles, whispered apologies, and little bits of truth passed over kitchen counters. A few days later, I found a yellow notice taped to my mailbox. It had the county seal printed at the top, but something about it looked wrong. It said I was under investigation for dumping old paint and construction waste near the creek. I read it twice and called the county office from the phone in my kitchen. A man named Harold Givens answered, tired as a man who had spent 20 years listening to strangers complain about septic tanks. I told him I had received a notice. He paused, asked me to read the case number, then said, "Mrs. Mercer, that number does not exist." I asked him if the county had issued the letter. He said, "No, ma'am," and I would keep that paper. I hung up slowly. For a minute I just stood there in the kitchen with the receiver in my hand, listening to the dial tone. Then I looked out the window toward the road and saw Walter's Lincoln turning the corner at the end of the lane. I wish I could tell you I handled it like a hero right then. Truth is, I got scared. Not the kind of scared where you scream or run, but the kind that makes you understand somebody is willing to lie about you on paper. And once they are willing to do that, you do not know where their line is anymore. That night I called Earl. He came over with a flashlight, 2 folders, and a bottle of Old Crow he kept under the front seat of his Buick. We sat at my kitchen table until after midnight, going through the fake notice, the legal letter, the survey maps, and every complaint Walter had sent. Earl poured a little whiskey into his coffee and said, "He is not trying to win an argument, Ruth. He is trying to wear you down. Men like Walter never believe a woman says no because she means no. They think she says no because nobody has pressured her hard enough yet." I looked at David's old flannel shirt hanging in the mudroom, then at the map of my father's land spread across the table. "What do I do?" I asked. Earl leaned back in his chair and said, "You stop playing defense." The next morning, I drove to a pawn shop in town and bought a used VHS camcorder. It was heavy as a brick, silver and black, with a shoulder strap that looked like it had survived a war. I had no idea how to use it at first. I recorded the kitchen ceiling for 10 minutes, taped my own face by accident and nearly dropped it in the sink. But by the end of the week, I had it set up in the window of the workshop facing Old Mill Lane. I also bought a little notebook, the kind truck drivers used, and started writing down dates, times, license plates, names, everything. Walter's Lincoln, 8:17 a.m. Stopped across driveway. Walter's pickup, 6:42 p.m. 2 men measuring creek line. Unknown truck, 2:11 a.m. Parked near shed. I did not feel powerful at first. I felt ridiculous, like a middle-aged widow playing detective in her own house. But there was something about writing things down that changed the air around me. Fear likes confusion. Facts make it nervous. The first real break came on a Thursday night in November. The temperature had dropped, and the kind of cold rain we get in western Pennsylvania was coming down sideways against the windows. I had just turned off the kitchen light when I heard an engine near the back fence. I pulled the curtain aside and saw headlights moving through the dark. At first, I thought it was a deer hunter or somebody lost, but then I saw a flatbed truck backing toward the creek. I grabbed the camcorder, slipped on David's old boots, and crouched behind the shed. The truck stopped. Two men got out, and one of them was Walter's nephew, Danny Baines, a lanky kid in his 20s who had worked for Walter at the hardware store years ago. They unloaded 6 black trash bags, 2 buckets, and something that looked like old roofing material. I stood there in the rain, shaking so hard I could barely hold the camera steady, but I kept recording. One man dragged a bag near the creek bank. Danny snapped pictures with a little disposable camera, then said, "That good enough?" Walter stepped out of the passenger side of the truck. I had not even seen him in there. He walks over, looked at the mess and said, "Make it look like it has been here a while." I remember those words more clearly than any other part of that night. Make it look like it has been here a while. Like he was dressing a stage. Like my life was just another room he could rearrange to make himself look important. I waited until they drove away, then called Earl from the kitchen phone. He said, "Do not touch anything. Call Harold in the morning. And Ruth, make 2 copies of that tape." I did. I made 1 copy at a video store in town, another at Claire's apartment when I drove up to Pittsburgh that weekend. Claire watched the tape in silence, sitting on the floor with her knees pulled up under her chin. When it ended, she looked at me and said, "Mom, why did you not tell me it was this bad?" I wanted to tell her because I did not want to worry her. I wanted to tell her because mothers are supposed to make life feel stable, even when it is not. But instead I said, because I was trying to handle it. She reached over, took my hand and said, "You do not have to handle everything alone just because Dad is gone." That one got me. I cried in my daughter's little apartment above a bakery while the smell of cinnamon rolls came through the floorboards, and for the first time in a long time I let myself admit how tired I was. Monday morning, Harold Givens came to inspect the creek. He was exactly what I expected, mid-50s, tan work jacket, steel-toed boots, clipboard, coffee in a foam cup. He looked at the trash bags, then looked at the muddy tire tracks. I showed him the tape on an old television in my workshop. He watched the whole thing without speaking. When Walter appeared on the screen, Harold leaned forward, took off his glasses, and said, "Well, I will be damned." I asked him what happened next. He said, "Next, I write a report, and then Mr. Baines has a problem." Walter did have a problem, but not enough of one to stop. He called a special meeting of the Briar Glen Covenant Committee and sent letters to every homeowner saying there had been serious concerns about environmental damage near my property. He told people he was only trying to protect the creek. He told them I was retaliating because he had asked me to cooperate with a road project. He even told Pam, his own secretary, that I had manipulated Harold into believing a staged video. That was when Marlene Hodge came to see me again, this time without a casserole. She had a stack of papers in her hand and an expression I had not seen before. Not nervous, not apologetic, just angry. She said, "Walter has been using committee money to pay for legal letters, survey work, and private security around your house." I asked her how she knew. She said her husband was the treasurer and he had been too afraid to question Walter until he saw the tape. "There are invoices, Ruth," she said. He called them road safety expenses. I sat down hard on the porch step. Somewhere behind us, a dog barked in the development. Marlene lowered her voice and said, "There is more. Walter has a side agreement with Harrison Ridge. If that road goes through, he gets paid as a consulting representative." I looked at her. Paid by who? The developer. I had known Walter wanted control. I had known he wanted the road. But money changes the shape of a story. It tells you why somebody keeps pushing even after they have humiliated themselves, lied, and crossed lines they should never cross. Walter was not protecting Briar Glen. He was selling it. That Friday, the Covenant Committee held a public meeting in the Briar Glen clubhouse. I wore my best navy skirt, the one I used to wear to church on Easter, and Claire came down from Pittsburgh to sit beside me. Earl was there in the back row with his old maps rolled under one arm. Marlene and her husband sat near the front, and Pam stood by the coffee urn looking like she wished she could disappear into it. Walter opened the meeting the way he always did, with a slow smile and a stack of papers. He talked about harmony, safety, property values, and community pride. He never said my name at first, but everybody knew who he meant. Then he said, "Some residents have chosen personal interests over the needs of the broader neighborhood." That was when I stood up. I will not lie, my knees felt weak. I'm not a person who enjoys standing in front of a room. I restore furniture. I like quiet work. Dust in the sunlight, the sound of a drawer sliding properly after you've fixed it. But I had spent too many months letting Walter speak for me. So I walked to the front with my folder, set it on the table, and said, "Since we are talking about personal interests, maybe we should talk about yours." The room went still. Walter looked at me like I had tracked mud across his carpet. I placed the recorded deed on the table, then Earl's survey map, then the county report about the dumped waste. Finally, I set down copies of invoices showing Briar Glen money being used to pay for letters against me and site visits connected to Harrison Ridge. Walter said, "This is completely out of order." I looked at him and said, "So was dumping trash behind my house at 2 in the morning. The room erupted. People started talking all at once. Someone shouted, "Is that true?" Another person said, "Walter, what is she talking about?" Walter tried to take control, but it was slipping through his fingers. He said the invoices were routine expenses. He said the video was misleading. He said I was emotional and did not understand development law. That last part made me so calm it almost frightened me. I looked at him and said, "Walter, I may not understand development law, but I understand when a man blocks my driveway, fakes county notices, and sends his nephew to dump garbage on my land. I also understand this. You thought I was alone and you were wrong. I wish I could tell you that ended it. It did not. People like Walter do not hear the word no as a conclusion. They hear it as an insult." 2 nights later, while I was in Pittsburgh helping Claire move into a better apartment, Walter had a black iron gate installed across Old Mill Lane. He did it fast under cover of darkness using a contractor from 2 counties over. When I drove home after midnight, rain coming down hard, I found the gate locked across the road with a sign that said, "PRI Fate 8 tests, authorized VH kills only." For a second I just sat there in my truck, staring at it. The headlights caught the rain bouncing off the metal, and all I could think was that my father had built that lane with his own hands. He had hauled gravel down it in a borrowed trailer, fixed washouts every spring, and driven my little girl to school along that road every day for 12 years. Walter had put a padlock on a piece of my history and called it private property. I got out, walked up to the gate, and found a note tucked under the chain. It said, "Contact the Briar Glen Covenant Committee to discuss access options." No signature, no need. I stood there in the rain with that note in my hand, and something inside me went quiet. Not defeated, not broken, just done. I drove back to the payphone outside the gas station and called the county road office. Nobody answered, so I called Earl. He picked up on the 3rd ring, sleepy and annoyed. I said, "Walter, put a gate across the easement." There was a long pause. Then Earl said, "Do not cut it. Do not touch it. We are going to do this right." Part 3. The ending. Monday morning started grey and cold, the kind of November day where the sky looks like somebody forgot to finish painting it. I had slept maybe 3 hours. Claire stayed with me all weekend, sleeping on the couch, making coffee, pretending not to notice every time I went to the window. Earl arrived before 8 with Harold Givens and a county roads supervisor named Nancy Caldwell, a woman in her early 60s who wore a red wool coat, work boots, and the expression of somebody who had spent her life telling men they were wrong and had gotten very good at it. She studied the gate, the deed, the survey map, and the old county records. Walter arrived 10 minutes later in his Lincoln, followed by 2 Briar Glen committee members and a lawyer from Pittsburgh who looked about 30 and kept checking his briefcase like it might save him. Walter stepped out of the car and said, "This is a private matter. The county has no authority here." Nancy looked at him over the top of her glasses and said, "Mr. Baines, this is a recorded access easement tied to a county road. You blocked it without authorization. So yes, we have authority here." Walter turned to me. "Ruth, you are making a terrible mistake. We could still work something out." I stared at him. "You mean I sign away my land and you give me permission to use the road my father already paid for?" His face tightened. "You are being stubborn." "No," I said. "I am being awake." Walter's lawyer stepped forward and started talking about private associations, future development plans, public benefit, and disputed boundaries. Earl rolled out the old survey map on the hood of my truck and held it down with a wrench because the wind kept trying to lift it. He pointed to the line with one crooked finger and said, "There, filed in 1958. reaffirmed in 1966, referenced in the county road book in 1979. You can call it whatever you want, son, but it is still a road. Nancy asked Walter if he had ordered the gate installed. He said it had been done for safety reasons. She asked whether he had a permit. He did not. She asked whether he had consulted the county. He had not. She asked whether he had any legal documentation showing Briar Glen owned the right-of-way. He did not. Then she looked at the road crew waiting behind us, the old yellow backhoe, the flatbed truck, the men in work jackets leaning against their equipment, and said, "Take it down." Walter lost it then. Really lost it. He walked in front of the backhoe, shouting that nobody was tearing down his gate, that the county was being manipulated, that I was a bitter woman who could not accept change. He pointed at me and said, "You have turned this whole neighborhood against me over a strip of dirt." I stood there under my umbrella, my hands shaking, and I said, "No, Walter. You turned them against you when you decided their homes, their money, and their peace of mind belonged to you." The road crew did not say a word. They just did their job. One man cut the chain with bolt cutters. Another loosened the concrete around the posts. The backhoe pulled. The gate leaned, and then with one long groan of metal and mud, it came down into the ditch beside the road. It was not glamorous. There was no music, no applause right away, no dramatic sunset. Just rain, diesel fumes, wet gravel, and the sound of something heavy finally giving up. But I will tell you this. When that gate hit the ground, I felt lighter than I had felt in years. Then the porch lights started flicking on all along Briar Glen. People came out in slippers, jackets, robes, work boots. Marlene stood near the mailbox with her husband. Pam was there. Harold was there. Even old Mr. Prove, Keen from the corner lot, who'd once complained about my porch swing squeaking after 10 o'clock, came out holding a flashlight. Nobody cheered at first. I think everyone was too stunned by how small Walter looked without his gate standing behind him. Then Marlene started clapping. Just 2 slow claps. Her husband joined in. Then Pam. Then Claire. By the time the road crew loaded the bent gate onto the truck, half the neighborhood was applauding in the rain. Walter did not look at any of us. He stood beside his Lincoln with his jaw tight, staring at the mud where the posts had been, like he could somehow force the ground to put them back. The county did more than remove the gate. Harold's report on the dumped waste went to the district office. The fake inspection notice went to the county solicitor. The Briar Glen board opened an audit after Marlene's husband admitted Walter had spent association funds on letters, survey work, and private meetings with Harrison Ridge. Walter resigned from the Covenant Committee 2 weeks later, though he called it stepping aside for personal reasons. People always call it personal reasons when the real reason is that everybody finally knows what they did. Harrison Ridge pulled its offer when the audit began. They claimed the road plan had become too complicated, which was a clean little business way of saying they did not want their name sitting next to Walter's in a county file. My property stayed mine. The workshop stayed open. I painted the shed the following spring, not because anyone told me to, but because I had finally decided I liked the color blue. I planted new shrubs along the creek, fixed the porch rail, and bought a better sander. And Claire came home more often after that. Sometimes she brought a boyfriend, then later a husband, and eventually a little boy who ran through my yard like he had been born, knowing every rock and fence post. The old pear tree still stands behind the workshop. It is bent and half hollow now, but every September it gives us more fruit than anybody wants, which feels about right. As for Walter, he sold his house in Briar Glen the following year and moved somewhere outside Erie, or so I heard. I never saw him again. The one afternoon in the summer of 1997, almost 2 years after the gate came down, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a copy of a new offer from Harrison Ridge, this one much higher than the first. The company wanted the same strip of land, but this time the paperwork was honest. Fair price, clear conditions, a real access agreement, no secret consulting fee, no committee man trying to bully me into surrendering what mattered. I sat on the porch with that offer in my lap for a long time. Part of me wanted to tear it up just because it reminded me of Walter. Another part of me wondered whether he had been wrong about the road or only wrong about the way he tried to get it. Maybe Briar Glen could have used another way in and out. Maybe more families would have been good for the town. Maybe I had spent so long fighting that I had forgotten progress, and surrender are not always the same thing. I never signed that offer, not because I was afraid, and not because I needed to prove anything anymore. I simply was not ready. Maybe I never would be. But that is the question I still think about sometimes when I sit on my porch in the evening, coffee in one hand, my grandson chasing lightning bugs near the creek. Was Walter wrong because he wanted change, or was he wrong because he believed he had the right to force it on everyone else? And was I protecting my home, or was I standing in the way of something bigger than me? I know what I believe, but I also know stories like this are never as simple as a gate, a road, and a man in a yellow raincoat. So tell me what you think. Was I right to fight Walter until the end? Or should I have sold that strip of land and let Briar Glen grow? Have you ever had someone try to take control of something that mattered to you, then call you selfish for refusing? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because I have learned one thing for sure. Sometimes the loudest person in the neighborhood is not the one who is right. They are just the one who has not been challenged yet.